In a narcissistic relationship, the jackpot is that they'll turn around and have empathy and not be mean and listen to you and be loving and patient and validating and kind and not betray you or lie to you and actually show up in a consistent manner. That's the jackpot. But there's another reason that we don't walk away from the machine. What is it? How many of you have ever said this about your narcissistic relationship? I can't live with them. I can't live without them. When I hear that phrase, you want to know what goes through my head? Trauma bond. Let's break that down. This is the challenge, right, of the narcissistic relationship. I can't live with them. I can't live without them. But really what you've done, and it gives you, people are like trauma bond, it all sounds so complex. It's really not. It's that. And this conversation about trauma bonding gets so complicated, and a lot of people struggle with, what is it? Let me tell you what it's not, because I've seen this common misconception out there in the internet world, is that a trauma bond is a relationship between two people who have been through trauma, and that's what joins them. You know, like that Keanu Reeves what was that movie? Speed, with a fast bus? It's not that. It's possible that two people who are trauma bonded have had trauma, but it's definitely not a requirement, okay? So the trauma bond is the intense connection that gets fostered in a relationship through the alternation of good moments and emotional abuse. And usually there's more bad moments than good moments. The good moments can be on a continuum. It's not all, fireworks, right? It can simply be someone pays attention to you at times, all the way to full court love bombing. And the middle may just be what feel like normal days. And the emotional abuse obviously would include things like invalidation, rage, manipulation, betrayal, humiliation. This alternation between good and bad results in a person making excuses and justifications and rationalizations, which cements the connection with the abusive person. Now, trauma-bonded people live their lives in a permanent purgatory of, I know I need to get out of this, but I can't figure it out, or I'm not ready, or I'm afraid to. And that fear is not just based on realistic fears of post-separation abuse or violence, but just the, I'm afraid what my life would be like without this person. Now, trauma-bonded relationships can really be coded in magical thinking. I can't describe what it is about this relationship. It's this crazy connection. It's almost magical, like I don't even know, like metaphysical. And you know my hack with clients to help them see the trauma-bondedness of their relationships. And if you don't, here it is. When a client I suspect is trauma bonded, is talking about their partner or their relationship, I will get to a point where I'll just simply ask them in an open and non-judgmental way, hey, can you tell me what it is you like and what you love about your partner? Invariably, the answer to that question is they get quiet for a minute. They look off to the distance, maybe up to the ceiling. They squinch up their mouth. Maybe they hold their chin. They say, It's a few deep sighs. And they say, I don't know. Let me think. I don't know. It's like beyond words. It's like, it's this feeling like, yeah, I can't articulate it. For shits and giggles, when I do ask clients who are in healthy relationships this same question, they'll say things like, I have tremendous respect for her. We have a history. We have shared values. Or he makes me laugh. Or I feel safe with them. We've built something together. We have similar interests. We love spending time together. There's a difference. But these relationships, if you really want to understand it, it boils down to a damned if I do, damned if I don't intersection that colors all narcissistic relationships. I can't live with them, and I can't live without them. We don't even need to break down why you can't live with them, so I'm not even going to waste time talking about that. But the bigger issue is the idea that you can't live without them, and that is the trauma bond piece. Obviously, you could live without anyone. You'd be fine, but you really believe you can't live without them. The idea of one of these relationships ending can leave a trauma-bonded person filled with panic. Like, wait, what if I'm making a mistake? Maybe it isn't that bad. Maybe I'm the problem. It feels like it's getting better. What if they move on? And what if they forget me? Or I'm just not ready. Sometimes issues like the fear of being alone can creep in as well. But the trauma bond gets revealed by the "I can't live without them" statement, despite all the bad things that are happening. Sometimes people make pithy statements like, well, they're the devil I know, and oh, I know, I'm a little bit of a handful myself. You probably aren't. Now, people sometimes struggle to understand what the trauma bond is. But if you can think of it this way, this idea of can't live with them, can't live without them, and you find that you really aren't able to come up with any meaningful reasons that this relationship is healthy, those are good signs. Now, I know that some people are afraid to consider this idea that their relationship may reflect a trauma-bonded situation, because they do often believe that it means then that they would have to end it. Recognizing these patterns in yourself and in your relationship don't mean that you have to push the accelerator on a change that you aren't ready to make. But it can be a wake-up call to consider therapy and recognizing that if the time comes that you decide to cut out of a trauma-bonded relationship, it's never going to be comfortable. But a good place to start is to stop the justifying and the rationalizing and the excuses. Simply recognizing the unhealthy behavior as unhealthy, that's often an essential first step. So again, can't live with them, can't live without them. So many people say this. Some people say it jokingly, but this is not the affectionate take on this. That idea that I can't live without them, A, sort of devalues you. You almost feel like some of your life force is coming from the relationship. It is also a reminder that no matter what, ending a trauma-bonded relationship, whether it's a year in or 40 years in, is always going to be difficult. And although a lot of this is sort of framed in sort of intimate relationships, this matters in family relationships too. Obviously, for many people, the original trauma bond is with a family member, and it can even be with a sibling. But in those relationships, it gets even more complicated because you might feel that same sense of I can't live with them, I can't live without them, certainly. But there's also the societal pressure and even the internal pressure you feel that families should stay close, that families should be in touch, that there's something wrong with you or shameful if you don't do that. But it's also that sense of that breathlessness of what if I'm wrong? And that's another real ringer for what sort of defines that trauma-bonded relationship. Your body has known for a long time that this relationship is not good for you. Whether you feel it in a million signs and signals, or may very well be that you get sick the more time you spend in the relationship. But no matter how loudly your body is talking to you, still your mind can be one hell of a gaslighter. But ultimately, that idea, damned if I do, damned if I don't, is the core of the trauma bond. And I hope that this explanation kind of takes this sort of theoretical concept and helps you see it more clearly and how it may have played out in your relationship. When we think about trauma bonding, we think about it loosely as the alternation between good and bad that happens in a relationship that creates it. That you hold out for the good day, you ruminate or selectively recall the one decent hour from vacation. You wonder why they all couldn't be that way. But I think that that does not actually get it fully right, because I know many of you feel very trauma bonded in at least one relationship. However, you also acknowledge that, Dr. Ramani, this does not alternate between good and bad. It sort of kind of either vacillates between abusive and kind of normal, and good isn't even part of the equation. So think about it. In a trauma-bonded relationship, you may have, for example, a normal conversation with a narcissistic person about what you did that day, or you might eat dinner together peacefully, or you might attend your child's sports game without much consternation or arguing, or you might have a normal meeting at work, or you might drop off something at your parents' home and nobody gets into an argument. I don't know that we'd quite call this good. It's just sort of, it's not bad. It's just sort of normal, right? However, then later that day, after your child's sports game, they may rage at you in the car, or after that work meeting, you might get that toxic passive-aggressive email that night saying that you were missing details in your report that were not meeting and that you were told some other stuff that didn't make sense right before you were going to go to bed. Or your parent calls you and says that you are ungrateful for not taking them to the doctor. Now, we've gone away from the normalish. Now we're in the more of the abusive space. So in these cases, you've alternated but what's sort of a normal relationship and sort of bad and abusive behavior. Okay, and I think we can call that bad. But it's not between good and bad. You aren't going back and forth between ecstasy or a fabulous trip or anything like that. The good for many trauma-bonded people is the normal. This confuses people who are listening and talking about trauma bonds, because they'll say, I don't think I'm alternating between good and bad. I actually think I might just be alternating between abusive and not abusive. And again, this is something else entirely, but this is more normally what happens in these relationships. So I think really it may be much simpler to think of trauma bonding, that unbreakable attachment you have in an unhealthy relationship, to think of that as being created by alternation. And that alternation may be between good and bad, bad and really bad, normal and bad. But the alternation may mean that a day when you're not yelled at is something you start to cherish. And you may feel that the day that you are not yelled at is a sort of relief. Sadly, that day you are not yelled at in your brain might get elevated to the idea of good, which means good kind of gets effed up, because it simply means then that the absence of rage, the absence of gaslighting or betrayal on a day is good. Good may be that they didn't text the person that they're cheating on you with for the whole weekend. So when good is this messed up, it becomes its own part of the trauma-bonded dynamic. In fact, very related to that idea of breadcrumbing. Now, when we use that slot machine analogy I use all the time, right? We keep playing the slot machine, right? Put our money in, we get some small rewards, put in $1, maybe we get $2. We get a lot of times where we just keep putting the money in, the machine just keeps taking our money, but we keep playing. Why do we keep playing? We keep playing because we think we can win the jackpot, the $1 million or whatever it is. In a narcissistic relationship, the jackpot is that they'll turn around and have empathy and not be mean and listen to you and be loving and patient and validating and kind and not betray you or lie to you and actually show up in a consistent manner. That's the jackpot. But there's another reason that we don't walk away from the machine. What is it? Well, one of them is the sunk cost fallacy. We already put in so much time or money, so we throw good money after bad. I never remember which it is. And we stick it out even when we're starting to go to the ATM to get more money. I sort of think that the sunk cost fallacy is us gaslighting ourselves. In the narcissistic relationship, that is when we stick around, stay in the relationship, keep believing they're future faking. And the slot machine does that by taking you right to the edge. Cherries, cherries, candy bar, dollar sign, diamond. No jackpot. The narcissistic person promises stuff that won't happen. Kind of takes you right to the edge again. And we also tell ourselves, well, maybe this will happen when they get the promotion. Or maybe things will get easier when the kids start school. Or maybe things will happen when they retire. It's not happening. But there's one more reason we don't walk away. And this is interestingly the one that whenever I ask this to a group, nobody guesses. What is the other reason we don't walk away? Sit with it. Think about it. Don't cheat. Don't look at the comments. Why? Because we think someone else will come and sit down at that slot machine that we have filled with our damn money, and that next person's going to hit the jackpot and hit it quick. In essence, take our stuff. And in a narcissistic relationship, that is the equivalent of being fearful that if we end the relationship, that the next person's going to get the better version of them. Folks, there is no better version. Just like that jackpot is probably not going to pay out of that slot machine when you walk away. But all of that said, the slot machine, which is based on that intermittent reinforcement schedule I've talked about, a few little payouts, lots of no payouts, a few larger payouts, and the hope of a jackpot all sort of coming at you randomly is really, really hard to let go of. We know that as part of behavioral science, right? But here is where the narcissistic relationship is more messed up than a slot machine. At least with the slot machine, you are holding out for a big prize that could happen, like lots of money. It's not likely, but maybe. Even if it's not the big jackpot, it could be like $1,000. That's still pretty good, right? But not only is that win, medium win or huge win, not an option in a narcissistic relationship. The narcissistic relationship may not really offer many rewards at all. It may be all take. Sometimes it'll be even money in the relationship. But the slot machine can't scream at you or hurt you or tell you that you are a loser or start giving the jackpot money or winnings from the machine to the person sitting next to you. If the slot machine did that to us, jackpot or no jackpot, we would walk away from it and then tell the casino people that the machine has gone bonkers and is screaming at us and is giving our money away. But yet, we endure that from a narcissistic person. So even the intermittent reinforcement of the narcissistic relationship, the very thing that is a contributor, biggest contributor to the trauma bond, that back and forth is really the back and forth between bad and not as bad. And in our minds, we may turn not as bad to normal or good. And in this way, the trauma bonded dynamic is something that is partly a result of the revisions we have to make in our minds to make sense of the relationship. And this is particularly pronounced for children with narcissistic parents. So just like you would do better, all of us would do better, not playing a slot machine at all, but at least playing a slot machine is fun. Recognize that the trauma bond may not just be between highs and lows, but just lows and really lows. And that is more than enough, maybe even worse, in keeping us stuck. When you think about it, the best way to play a slot machine is to set a limit for yourself. You say, I'm not going to play more than $100. And when it's gone, I'm out. Think of what the equivalent to that would be in a narcissistic relationship. How many betrayals? How many invalidations? How much loss? How much disrespect has to mount up before you walk? And just like that $100 may last a minute, because you might get a few small wins, the key is to know to walk when it runs out. So maybe if you could set it to once I spend 100 betrayals here, I may need to walk out of this casino. Maybe that's the only way to address these trauma bonded patterns. And remember that it's not only highs and lows, but it's bads and not so bads, and not so bads that we convince ourselves are good. That, my friends, is the trauma bond. So breadcrumbing may have a little bit of a cutesy name, but it's really no joke. It's a pretty nefarious dynamic. Breadcrumbing is the gradual adjustment and accommodation to getting less and less in a relationship and still making the relationship work. It's a phase of the relationship that I often think of as bridging devaluation into discard. Whatever attentiveness, attunement, or presence there once was in the relationship has faded, and the dazzle of the love bomb has long disappeared. But even devaluing requires some attention. So when you get into this transition, into the discard phase, there's just less of everything. However, you may still have skin in the game of the relationship. You may still feel like you love the person that you're in this relationship with. You may not know what narcissism is. You may want to hold on to the good moment as those good moments show up in the relationship, and they often do in narcissistic relationships. And you may not understand what's happening in the relationship. Now, as breadcrumbing begins, you may try to be more and more, do more, be more, to get some kind of reaction out of them. You may change your appearance. You may talk about cool things that are happening to you or that you saw, that you're a part of. You may ask them about themselves. You just want to get them to see you because it's crazy making when someone doesn't. And in the breadcrumbing phase, they're seeing you and caring about you less and less. You may read relationship books and believe that you need to be more seductive and more grateful or have date nights. Breadcrumbing, in a way, is a reflection of the narcissistic person finally having had their fill of your supply. It doesn't mean, though, that they are willing to get rid of it. They're never going to get enough supply, right? But yours, and I know it's painful to hear this, but yours and all of us, it's a collective, all of ours, it isn't compelling enough. And that's not because there's something wrong with you or that there's something lacking in you, but it's because narcissistic people are inherently novelty seekers and they're easily bored. So once they no longer have the chase with you, they breadcrumb you, you are still there, they don't have to do much, and that's pretty much that. We witness breadcrumbing in most trauma-bonded relationships. It can show up as a relative indifference in the narcissistic person unless they need something or they are frustrated. Then you will see their rage and their emotion. However, otherwise, you're going to see that they're checked out and they're much more engaged in stuff that matters to them, whether that's work or career or friends or hobbies or something that may be relatively unrelated to you. So in that way, breadcrumbing is simply an expectable part of all trauma-bonded narcissistic relationships at some point. But there's another piece to this. Does the breadcrumbing actually magnify and fortify the trauma bonding? The breadcrumbing creates a dynamic in the narcissistic relationship where you get accustomed to getting by in the relationship on less and less. You are thankful that they merely came home for dinner, or that they actually remembered to say happy birthday on your birthday, or that they didn't criticize you. The bar moves so low that you basically have to tunnel to get under it. The breadcrumbing means that the relationship is rationalized on the basis of the tiniest of things, or on the basis of the absence of abuse. Things like, we had such a good day. He didn't yell at me once today. The vacation was wonderful. My mother wasn't demanding about the hotel room at all. We're doing so good. She didn't look at her phone once during dinner. Remember that the trauma bond gets built on the basis of that alternation between good and bad. The breadcrumbing is an almost invisible or almost too small to see version of the good. So by the time the breadcrumbing is fully in play, the trauma bond is really a vacillating between bad and not as bad. And when that is happening, the level of justification, accommodation, self-blame, and betrayal blindness that are needed to maintain the relationship can feel almost delusional. But while we do it, we aren't aware of what an actual break from reality it is. No narcissistic person can keep the love bombing going on for a very extended period of time. And invariably, the entitlement, the carelessness, and their indifference will slowly devolve into breadcrumbing. And once devaluing starts, the trauma bonding process slowly kicks in. Breadcrumbing can solidify that process, and we learn to get by on very little. If this happened to you as a child, and it happens to many children with narcissistic parents, the smallest thing the parent does gets cherished and held onto. That's survival, allowing the child to remain attached and to construct a mental model for themselves of a so-called good parent. Doing that can prepare us for a lifetime of subsisting on breadcrumbs. In fact, some folks may even try to hold on to it or be praised for it, for being willing to go on breadcrumbs. Things like, oh, you're so easy, you expect so little. When people say that to you, that's not a good thing. And yet we do praise people for actually almost being amenable to breadcrumbing. So not only is breadcrumbing a manifestation of the trauma bond, it may actually be an accelerator of it too. Strangely, the rationalizations we make once we are being breadcrumbed are often more pronounced. It seems paradoxical that when so little is being given, that's happening. But it may very well be that having to rationalize the tiny little gets, or just the mere absence of cruelty, can result in us creating more elaborate justifying narratives about the relationship. And that is how cognitive dissonance works. We don't talk enough about breadcrumbing, actually, I don't think. And we may even glorify people who make the so-called most out of a breadcrumbed situation. It's the relationship equivalent of dying on the vine. Making sense of it, though, trying to understand the breadcrumbing, even justifying the breadcrumbing, that doesn't make you complicit in this dynamic. It's simply a part of you trying to remain connected in something and to someone that often doesn't make sense. It's always easier to blame ourselves until it isn't. Let's say I came into your house with a can of paint and I just spilled it and threw it at the walls and made a huge mess. And then I upended the furniture, I blocked up your sinks, I smashed your windows, and I sliced up your sofas. And then I came back and I offered to clean it up. Most of you would think, get the hell out of my house. You're the one who messed it up. I am calling the police. And yet, in narcissistic relationships, this is a classical trauma-bonded dynamic. The narcissistic person comes into your life, makes a mess of it, kind of offers to clean it up, and people let them come back in and say, sure, come help me clean up the mess that you made of my life. So how the hell does that work? Well, let's start with first. Sometimes that's where the narcissistic relationship can actually start. When we have talked about the different kinds of people who are often the more likely targets of narcissistic relationships, that can include people who have had a history of trauma or significant loss, or people who are going through a difficult or a transitional time. At those times, we feel messy and unsettled and almost like we need someone to clean things up for us, right? It's exactly the kind of situation a person with a narcissistic personality may try to exploit. They may sweep in and as part of love bombing may offer help or support, may give advice or guidance as they clean up our perceived messiness. They may tell us, oh, you're so lovable despite whatever messes we are enduring. This is the stuff that would often happen early in a relationship. And while it is dangerous because it sets up a dynamic of them as the savior and the other person in the relationship as in need of saving, this other dynamic I'm about to talk about is a much bigger problem. Psychologically speaking, a narcissistic person is a one-person wrecking crew. They slowly dismantle us and often prey upon people who have their own attachment issues. So when the narcissistic person who is manipulative comes into contact with someone who has, let's say, an anxious attachment style, that becomes a recipe for a trauma-bonded catastrophe. The cycle of love bomb, calm, chaos, break up, get back together, calm, chaos, break up, get back together. That's a classical trauma-bonded cycle and a classical sort of anxious attachment cycle. But with each one of those cycles, you are being increasingly invalidated, gaslighted, manipulated, and end up feeling more and more confused, helpless, self-blaming, self-doubting, anxious, and upside down. You basically feel like a mess, right? And that works beautifully for the narcissistic person because you look externally like the messier one. They are actually soothed by you being off balance, and they can become quite calm and composed under those conditions, and may even appear to be soothing you. Oh, babe, I know you're going through a hard time. I got you. You just got to do some work on yourself. So then in response to that, now you go into therapy because you're the one who is the mess, right? And they are soothing you. But it was a mess that this relationship made. Lots of people will say, you know what? I was actually doing okay in my life when I met this narcissistic person. Sure, I had my demons and my wounds, but I was doing fine. I thought I met this person. We had a good thing. It was fun. They were smart or sexy or compelling or whatever charismatic, scrumptious, narcissistic thing they were. And then, as they do, around the 2-month mark, the cracks slowly appear, the red flags, you justify, the usual drill. As more time passes, you are really confused. The good day, bad day cycle begins. You justify, you rationalize, you want it to work. You doubt yourself, you become anxious, you doubt reality, you start feeling messy, helpless, and powerless. And then the narcissist may say things like, "Damn, your anxiety is really stressing me out." Or you may find yourself feeling more and more suspicious and feel like a private eye staking out their social media or watching their rhythms because something about them feels shady and you feel like you're losing your mind. Or you find that you get so preoccupied and that gets in the way of work or school. And you start getting more and more isolated because you're getting lost in the vortex of the relationship, and that gets dangerous because what might be happening now is you're getting pulled away from your supports, which is the only thing stopping you from being gaslighted. As you start feeling messier, it becomes easier for the narcissistic person to sort of play with you, cat and mouse style, to hoover you. You start to believe that, oh, this is my person and I'm the one who's a mess, and that you have to make it work. You bargain with yourself. You focus on the idea that someone else is going to get them who's not looking at as sort of anxious as you, and that you're thinking, oh, I'm always going to be alone because I'm such a mess. And so when they do hoover, or perhaps as it feels like they're slipping away or you're in the discard phase, you may even start leaning into your identity as a mess. And aren't they wonderful for staying with you? And it's like they are doing you a favor by staying with you despite your so-called neurosis and your anxiety and your bad memory and your emotion or your drama. They make messes, then they sweep in and pretend to clean them up, and you believe that they are doing right by you. By understanding narcissistic abuse and what it does to you, you can identify this pattern. That you are the one who feels like the weak one, the messed up one, and that you run the trauma-bonded risk of subjugating yourself to needing to be rescued and allowing them back in to clean up the mess that they made. This doesn't only happen in intimate relationships. Families can do this too. Bring you into bad schemes or plans, invalidate, gaslight, manipulate, and confuse. You feel completely upside down, and then they come in and offer to fix it. The therapy world can play into this as well. Narcissistic folks can actually present really calmly and look really well put together in couples therapy. The charming narcissist sitting next to the rather upset, anxious, and wide-eyed other non-narcissistic person, unless the therapist knows what they are looking at, it can be easily framed as, well, let's work on this messy person's anxiety and get this relationship tidied up. That idea of fixing the other person, the survivor of the narcissistic abuse, and never addressing the manipulation and the personality of the person making the mess is a real problem that can occur in couples therapy. In a way, it's like an arsonist who sets a fire so he can pretend to be the hero and put it out. They're making a mess so they can be the fixer. Be aware of red flags and of what narcissistic abuse does to us, how it impairs our judgment, how it's not you. Really, it's them. And the worst thing you can do is allow the fixer to be the very one who broke it. You aren't broken after these relationships. You're confused. And I must say that if you understand narcissistic abuse, it's a big first step to unconfusing you. You aren't damaged after these relationships. Again, you're merely confused. And this is always worse if the confusion plays on your core wounds. But pay attention to this dynamic. Narcissistic abuse happens. You feel confused and anxious and self-doubting and self-blaming. You feel messy. And then the narcissistic person, especially during the hoover, comes in and says, oh, let me take care of you. It seems like you're going through a tough time. In essence, they're offering to clean up your mess. But it's not your mess. It's a mess they created. And they're playing upon this diminished version of yourself, the loss of self-esteem that all survivors go through. If they made the mess, you'll clean it up. But please don't let them in to pretend to clean up the mess, because they're just going to make it. I'm going to be talking a little bit about trauma bonding today, which I talk about a lot, but I'm going to be talking about it in a very specific way and really going to be breaking down this question. And I wonder how many of you ask yourself this question: why do I feel like I'm the bad person in my narcissistic relationship? Have any of you ever asked yourself that question? Like, I feel like I'm the bad one? If you do, drop it in the comments. It'd be interesting to see how many of you watching this saying, yes, I feel like I'm the bad one. We're going to break that down. Before we get to that, gentle reminder, go to those video notes. If you do feel like you're the bad person, you do need some healing, come join us in this healing program and hit that link. And also, please subscribe if you're new to this channel. If you end up liking this video, tiny bit of validation goes a long way for me. So let's take this question on around trauma bonding and self-blame. But why is it in narcissistic relationships that people, despite being narcissistically abused, that so many people feel like they are the bad person in these relationships? So at this point on this channel, on this YouTube channel, we have talked about trauma bonding ad nauseum, what it is, the different things that sort of describe trauma bonding, but mostly we talk about how trauma bonding keeps us stuck in these relationships or drawn to narcissistic relationships in the first place. What about after you decide to do something about your narcissistic relationship? Maybe you decide to end your relationship, or maybe you decide to go no contact with someone, or you massively gray rock or firewall, or not only disconnect from the narcissist, but all of the enablers. You do that, and then you look at the narcissistic person and they actually kind of seem sad to see you go, or they seem kind of lost without you, or they kind of slump about in a victimized way. Now, they may still also do and say manipulative, gaslighting, mean things when you're around them, but once you decide to do what you do, to step away maybe, you can see that they're impacted by it, even if they don't say it. And it's at that point when they're like, oh, this person's a little hurt. Nearly every survivor of narcissistic abuse I have ever talked to or worked with will say, ugh, I feel like I'm the bad person. I feel like I'm a bad person because I'm not talking to them anymore, or I'm not engaging, or I'm setting these boundaries with my parent or my ex or my adult child or my friend or my sibling. I feel like I'm mean. I feel like I've become so dark-hearted. And then it starts to slip pretty quickly from there, and people start thinking, maybe I'm a monster. Maybe I'm the narcissist. Pushing back on narcissistic abuse is no joke. It sounds so easy in words. Oh, don't defend, don't engage, don't explain, gray rock, don't respond, walk away. Intellectually, we can all acknowledge that those are all choices, and probably good ones in a narcissistic relationship. But when you make those choices, you feel sick. Many people literally report feeling sick to their stomachs, losing their appetite, getting headaches, just because they're setting consistent boundaries, or when they finally say enough is enough and don't engage. You know the dance. You all do. You know that if you stay in this relationship, nothing's ever going to change. And many people do stay just so they don't have to feel sick and don't have to feel like the bad person, to not have to feel like that mean person. Actually doing it, actually setting the boundary, actually not engaging, actually seeing that when you pull away, in more than a few cases, the narcissistic person may look lost or sad or pathetic. They may actually look like they miss you, or they tell you how much you ruined their lives, or they go really heavy on all the self-victimized stuff. It's a terrible feeling. It's as though every trauma-bonded cell in your body orients toward not wanting to be the one that feels like the bad one, the mean one, the cold one. And you may even feel that perhaps this relationship is sort of your penance or your bad luck, and you stick it out so you don't have to feel like a bad person. If you really want to hear a sick twist on this one, I was raised in a very traditional Hindu South Asian family where I have had contact with many, many people who are in terrible marriages or terrible family situations say, I am being punished from my behavior in a past life. I must owe this person, and they're talking about the abuser, something. So I'm telling you now, I know about some deep trauma bonded cultural religious stuff that can twist a person's mind. So many survivors of narcissistic abuse are at risk for feeling that it's easier to take the role of enduring the narcissist's BS and maltreatment than it is to walk away and manage not only the discomfort of feeling like the cruel one, but also manage all the criticisms you'll get from people outside of you, outside of the relationship. Now, there's no easy answer here. It's a process. You do have to pay attention to how you feel. Now, when the narcissist is cut out of your life and they're not around, you're going to feel better in many ways. Less stressed, more content, maybe even happy. Over time, you may feel more brave, courageous. And the less and less contact you have with the narcissist, maybe even less plagued by self-doubt. While some narcissists don't care if you leave, many do. And remember that abandonment and related issues are a part of narcissism. So they may actually not do well when you go. And there will be times you will be ruminating on that icky, awful feeling of having done something to someone that does not feel good to you. The more empathic you are, the more this way of thinking is going to bring you down. Sadly, this is where your empathy, a wonderful part of you, is actually kind of keeping you stuck. Your empathy makes you vulnerable to falling back into it as well because you don't want to feel like a bad person because you're not. This is the legacy of narcissistic abuse I actually hate the most. The idea that stepping away and setting boundaries and saving yourself, that you have to carry along with that, this burden that you're not a nice person. And sadly, the prevailing wisdom in the world is that the people who put up and shut up are somehow, maybe they're not so mean, right? Because it means that at some level, survivors of narcissistic abuse cannot win. They either have to be abused in the relationship or live with this sense that you did something bad. Well, here's the good news. Over time, that idea that you are bad, it'll slowly fade. Narcissistic abuse changes us in permanent ways. It means that we cannot live like little children in a fantasy world anymore. That we recognize that life is a series of really hard choices that are often unpopular, especially if we are trying to attempt to protect ourselves. And there's no magical moment when a fairy god person comes down and waves a wand and makes the trauma bonds go away or gives us a happy ending after our trauma bonds. Nope. Survivors of narcissistic abuse learn that to set boundaries and disengage is uncomfortable and unpopular, and with time, we recognize that no, we are not bad people, but that we did have to save ourselves, and yet that felt really uncomfortable. Many of you know that I believe that a major part of healing is journaling and record keeping. A powerful method of doing that, pessimistic and awful as it feels, is to write down all of the bad things that happened in the relationship. I want you to keep all of the abusive text messages and emails. When those trauma-bonded feelings come up, when you feel guilty or bad or mean, please read all of that. When you feel that you are being mean or bad or misreading the situation, going back and seeing all that stuff you wrote down that was sent to you, it can be eye-opening and it can be your salvation. At some level, getting out of a toxic relationship and the bad feelings that accompany it are a form of survivor guilt. Self-preservation and self-protection are all very nice sounding words, but putting them into practice is a whole other level. And it's a whole nother experience for people who are trauma bonded. You always feel like you're trying to swim against some kind of psychological current or riptide. So no, I'm here to tell you, you are not a bad person for setting boundaries and disengaging and creating distance from someone who harmed you and will continue to harm you. You made a choice to take care of yourself. The narcissistic person is making a choice too, to abuse people, including you. They have the freedom to make another choice. They just aren't. Their bad choice, though, cannot remain your prison. Hope that makes sense. But that thinking I'm the bad person for these things I'm doing in this relationship, like distancing myself and seeing the victimization on their face, you are not a bad person. That is a classic manipulation, and I want to break you out of that. I understand it's uncomfortable, but all growth is uncomfortable. And you want to hear more about growth and discomfort and how to grow through it? Our healing program, that's the place for you. Please go to the video notes, hit that link, come join us. We'll be doing a lot of this kind of work. Thanks again.